The station was dying. Lights flickered like weak candles in a storm. The air was thin and cold, biting at every breath. Jack Carter, a human engineer, moved carefully through the narrow metal corridors. His boots crunched on ice that had formed. Over the floor plates, the life support system had failed hours ago. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the silence. It was faint, like nails scratching on metal. He stopped and listened. The scratching came again, this time followed by a soft, trembling whimper. Jack's heart began to pound. Someone was here, someone small, and they were in trouble. He followed the noise, stepping over fallen pipes and frozen cables. At the end of the corridor was a dark service alcove. The noise was louder now, mixed. With shallow breathing, Jack switched on his flashlight and pointed it inside. That's when he saw her. She was tiny, barely reaching his waist, and her skin was pale blue, almost glowing in the flashlight beam. Her large, bright eyes looked at him with both fear and defiance. She was wrapped in a torn, dirty piece of cloth that did nothing. Against the freezing air, her thin shoulders shook violently as she tried to pull the fabric tighter. Her lips trembled, and steam escaped with every weak breath. She was shivering so hard it looked painful. Jack crouched down, holding out his gloved hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey, it's okay," he said slowly. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding the words. Her eyes darted toward the flashlight, then to the small heating unit strapped to his belt. Her gaze lingered there, hunger in her eyes, not for food, but for warmth. The cold was getting worse. Jack could see frost forming on the edges of her hair. If she stayed here much longer, she would die. He shrugged off his thermal jacket and held it out to her. But instead of taking it, she pressed herself against the corner of the alcove, glaring at him like a trapped animal. Jack realized she wasn't just afraid of the cold. She was afraid of him. He sighed and took a step closer, speaking softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She shook her head, muttered something in her own language, and wrapped her arms tighter around herself. The shivering grew worse. Her legs, thin and fragile, trembled under her weight. Jack knew the signs of hypothermia. If she didn't get heat soon, her body would shut down without warning. Her knees buckled. She fell forward, and Jack caught her before she hit the icy floor. She was shockingly light, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Her skin was freezing to the touch. Like holding a block of ice, Jack didn't waste time. He lifted her into his arms, adjusting his grip so his body heat could reach her. She was stiff at first, resisting even in weakness. But as he carried her down the corridor, she stopped struggling. Her head rested weakly against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, but at least it was steady. He found a maintenance room with a half-working door and forced it open. Inside, it was dark and cramped, but at least the walls would keep out some of the cold. He sealed the door behind them, blocking the corridor's freezing draft. Jack set her down gently on a pile of old insulation sheets. She looked at him through half-closed eyes, still wary but too weak to move. He took out his portable heat lamp from his kit and set it near her. The glow spread slowly, pushing the cold back just a little. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Jack didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she was here. And she didn't know if she could trust him. But the truth was simple. If they didn't work together, they wouldn't survive outside. The station groaned. Somewhere in the distance, a deep metallic clang echoed through the corridors. The sound made the girl flinch. Jack noticed it and frowned. That reaction wasn't from the cold. It was fear. Fear of something else moving in the dark. He didn't know it yet, but this tiny alien wasn't just lost. She was being hunted. And by the end of this night, her shivering wouldn't just be from the freezing air. Asterisk. The maintenance room was small and cramped. The walls were covered with frost. And the only light came from Jack's small heat lamp. The faint orange glow lit up the alien girl's pale blue skin, making her seem almost unreal. She sat curled up on the insulation sheets, staring at him like a cornered animal, her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Jack knelt down beside her, holding the thermal jacket again. He slowly draped it over her shoulders, watching for any sign that she might resist. She didn't push it away this time. Instead, she gripped the fabric tightly, her small fingers clutching it as if it was the only thing keeping her from freezing solid. Jack could feel the icy air against his own skin now that he wasn't wearing the jacket, but he didn't care. The girl needed it more. The heat lamp wasn't enough. The station's temperature had dropped dangerously. Even inside this sealed room, the cold was creeping in through the walls. Jack rubbed his hands together, blowing into them for warmth. Then he noticed her eyes following his movements. Her gaze was sharp. She was watching him like she was trying to learn. She pointed at his chest, then at herself. Jack frowned, not sure what she meant. She repeated the motion, then shuffled closer. Before he could react, she pressed herself against him. Her small frame fit awkwardly against his side, her head barely reaching his shoulder. Her skin was ice cold, but he could feel her trying to soak in his body heat. Jack tensed for a moment. He wasn't expecting this. It was instinct, survival, but something about the way she did that felt almost deliberate. Her hands rested on his side, and her tail, he hadn't noticed it before, curled around his waist without hesitation. He kept his voice gentle. "All right, stay close," he said, even though she didn't understand his words. She tilted her head slightly, listening to the tone rather than the meaning. It seemed to calm her. Minutes passed in silence. The faint hum of the heat lamp was the only sound. Jack tried to think of a plan. They couldn't stay here forever. The air recyclers were dead, and sooner or later, they'd run out of oxygen. They needed a working power source, and fast. Suddenly, she tapped his arm and pointed toward the far wall. Jack followed her gesture and saw a small maintenance hatch, almost hidden behind a stack of broken panels. He didn't remember seeing it on the station's schematics. She motioned for him to follow and crawled toward it, her movements quick despite the cold. Jack hesitated, then grabbed his tools and the heat lamp before joining her. The hatch creaked as he opened it. A blast of even colder air rushed in, making them both shiver. Beyond it was a narrow passage, low enough that Jack had to crouch. The girl slipped inside without fear, looking back to make sure he followed. Her trust was strange. One moment she acted like he was a threat. The next she led him into the darkness as if he was her only hope. The passage twisted and turned. Their footsteps echoed softly on the frozen metal. Jack's flashlight beam revealed frost-covered pipes, leaking vents, and strange alien markings scratched into the walls. He glanced at the girl. She ran her fingers over one of the markings, her face tightening. It wasn't decoration. It was a warning. Before Jack could ask anything, they both froze. There was a sound, distant but clear. Metal boots, heavy and slow. The echo carried through the passage, making it impossible to tell how far away the source was. The girl's eyes went wide. With panic, she grabbed Jack's hand and pulled him toward a side tunnel. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small. They ducked into the side tunnel just as the sound grew louder. Jack turned off his flashlight, holding his breath. Through the faint blue light of frost reflections, he saw a shadow move past the main corridor. It was tall, far taller than any human, and its shape was wrong. Spines jutted from its back, and its head turned sharply, sniffing the air. Jack felt the girl's trembling increase. She pressed herself against him again. Not for warmth this time, but for safety. The shadow lingered, then moved on, the footsteps fading. Jack waited a full minute before turning his flashlight back on. The girl was still holding his hand, refusing to let go. Her eyes met his, and in her broken voice, she whispered in halting human words, "They want me." Jack didn't know who they were, but one thing was certain. He couldn't leave her here. If they wanted her badly enough to send hunters into the freezing wreck of this station, then she was in more danger than he had imagined. He gave her a reassuring nod. "Then they're going to have to go through me first," he muttered under his breath. She tilted her head, not understanding, but the tone in his voice seemed to give her comfort. Together, they moved deeper into the dark passages. The cold was still biting at their skin, but now, the real danger wasn't the freezing air. It was whatever was hunting them. And Jack knew, somewhere deep down, that this was only the beginning. The narrow passage felt endless. Jack's breath came out in pale clouds, and his fingers were starting to go numb. The alien girl stayed close, her small hand gripping his sleeve as if letting go would mean losing everything. Her steps were light, almost silent, but her ears twitched at every sound. Jack could tell she had been through these tunnels before. She moved with purpose, as if she knew exactly where to go. They came to a junction where the metal walls were scratched and dented. Jack shone his flashlight over the marks and realized they weren't random. They were symbols carved deep into the metal with something sharp. The girl crouched down and touched one of them with trembling fingers. Her lips moved in a whisper he couldn't understand. It sounded like a name. Maybe of someone she had lost. Jack crouched beside her. "What is it?" he asked softly. She looked at him with wide eyes, then pointed at the markings and traced a line to a symbol that looked like a broken circle. Jack didn't know the language, but something about that symbol made him uneasy. It felt like a warning. Her expression confirmed it. She made a slashing motion across her throat, then tapped the floor twice. A silent message. Danger ahead. A low creak echoed down the tunnel. Jack froze. The sound wasn't metal settling. It was movement. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The girl's ears flattened, and she pulled him toward another hatch, smaller than the last one. They slipped through, and into a cramped chamber filled with old machinery. The air was warmer here, faintly humming with power. Jack scanned the room and saw why. Against the far wall was a glowing cylinder, a small reactor still functioning despite the station's failing systems. It wasn't much, but it could power lights, heat, maybe even comms. Jack's heart leapt. If he could connect to the station's main lines, they might be able to call for help. But before he could move toward it, the girl grabbed his wrist and shook her head violently. She pointed to the shadows above. Jack followed her gaze and saw something that made his stomach tighten. In the rafters, clinging to the pipes, were three spider-like machines. Their bodies were sleek, black, and insectoid, with glowing red sensors scanning the room. Silent sentinels, motion-triggered, armed and deadly. Jack understood now. The reactor wasn't abandoned. It was guarded. The girl made a small whimper and pressed close to him. Jack whispered, "We'll find another way." Though he knew she couldn't understand, still, the tone seemed to calm her. They backed out slowly, every movement careful. One wrong sound, and those machines would drop from the ceiling. Finally, they slipped back into the corridor, closing the hatch silently behind them. They walked for several minutes in tense silence. Then Jack noticed a strange vibration under his boots. It was faint but rhythmic. The girl noticed too. Her ears twitched again, and she knelt, pressing her hand to the floor. When she looked up, her expression was grim. She pointed ahead, then to her own chest, and then made a cage shape with her hands. Jack's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying they have more of you?" She didn't answer in words. Instead, she started running, pulling him along. Jack's long strides barely kept up with her speed. The tunnel sloped downward until it opened into a vast cargo bay, or what used to be a cargo bay. Now it was something else entirely. Dim lights flickered over rows of cages. Inside them were figures, small like the girl, but some were motionless, others huddled together for warmth. Jack's stomach turned. It wasn't just one alien girl in trouble. There were dozens. The girl let go of his hand and ran to one of the cages, pressing her fingers through the bars. A tiny voice answered from inside. Another child, even smaller than her. The two exchanged quick, soft sounds in their own language. Jack didn't need to understand the words to feel the urgency. But then a voice cut through the cold air, deep, rough, and in a language Jack didn't know. Heavy footsteps followed. From the far end of the bay, a tall alien figure stepped into view. Its body was covered in thick armor plates, and in its clawed hands was a weapon that hummed with energy. The girl froze, fear locking her in place. Jack reacted instantly, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind a stack of crates. They crouched in the shadows as the armored alien moved down the row, checking the cages one by one. It was a hunter, maybe the same kind whose shadow they had seen earlier. Its head turned sharply, and for a moment, Jack thought it had seen them, but it moved on, muttering something into a cum device. When it was gone, Jack looked at the girl. Her eyes were fierce now. She pointed at the cages, then at him. Her meaning was clear. She wanted his help to free them. Jack knew it was insane. They were unarmed. The bay was crawling with hunters, and the cold was still killing the station. But as he looked at the small, shivering faces behind the bars, he knew there was no choice. He gave her a slow nod. She smiled for the first time, just a small fleeting smile. But it carried a promise. They were in this together now, somewhere deep inside. Jack realized that whatever the station's original purpose was, it had turned into something far darker, and now, he had stumbled right into the heart of it. Jack's mind was racing. The image of those cages was burned into his thoughts. The small faces, the trembling bodies, the hopeless eyes, they were all counting on someone to help. And right now, the only one who could try was him. But there was no way he could do it alone. He needed the tiny alien girl's help as much as she needed his. They moved silently through the dim corridors, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the cargo bay. Jack knew they couldn't free the others without a plan. The girl walked beside him now, not behind. Not clinging, just matching his steps. Her ears twitched at every noise, her eyes constantly scanning. She wasn't just a helpless survivor. She was cautious, aware, and quick. When they stopped in a small storage room, Jack turned to her. He held up his hand and said slowly, "We work together." She tilted her head, not fully understanding. Jack tapped his own chest, then hers, and linked his fingers together. "Together," he repeated. A slow realization showed in her eyes. She nodded once, a sharp and determined gesture. Jack needed to teach her some basic words. If they were going to act under pressure, they couldn't waste time with confusion. He took a piece of metal scrap and drew on the dusty floor. He sketched a figure running. "Run." He sketched an open hand. "Stop." He drew a crouched figure. "Hide." She repeated each word in her own accent, her voice quiet but clear. Sometimes she smiled when she got it right. It wasn't much, but it was progress then. She surprised him. She took the scrap and drew something herself. A simple outline of the station's main deck. Jack blinked in surprise. She had been here long enough to know the layout. She pointed to their current location, then to a series of connected passages that led to a marked circle. Jack guessed it was a hidden path to the cargo bay. The route was narrow and avoided the main halls. If it was real, it could give them a way to reach the cages without alerting the hunters. But there was a problem. The door to that path was locked from the outside. Jack pointed to the lock, raising an eyebrow. She grinned, a mischievous little smile that didn't match her usual fear. From under her tattered cloth, she pulled out a small, jagged tool. Jack realized it was a handmade lockpick. She must have scavenged it over time. This tiny girl wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. Before they set out, Jack rummaged through the storage crates. He found a half-functional cum device, a coil of insulated wire, and an old plasma torch with a few minutes of charge left. It wasn't much, but it could be enough to cut through cage locks in an emergency. The girl tested the torch herself, nodding in approval at the flicker of blue light. They began their journey toward the hidden path. The corridors were colder here, the lights dimmer. At one point, the sound of metal boots echoed in the distance. The girl tapped Jack's arm and whispered, "Hide." They slipped into a narrow gap between two broken panels, crouching low as a pair of hunters passed by. Jack could feel her small heartbeat against his arm. Fast but steady, she wasn't panicking, she was waiting. Calculating, when the hunters were gone, they moved again. The girl led them to a sealed hatch halfway down a deserted hallway. It was covered in frost. The control panel long dead. Jack stepped back as she knelt down and worked the lockpick. Her small hands moved quickly, twisting the metal in ways Jack didn't understand. Within seconds, the hatch clicked open. She looked up at him with a proud little smirk. Jack chuckled quietly. Not bad. Inside was a maintenance shaft barely wide enough for them to crawl through. The air was stale and even colder than before. Their breath fogged the narrow space, and frost crunched under their palms as they moved. The sound of the station's failing structure echoed all around. Somewhere far above, Jack thought he heard a distant metallic roar. The girl glanced back at him, eyes narrowing. Whatever that sound was, she recognized it, but she didn't explain. Halfway through the shaft, they stopped to rest. Jack handed her a small piece of nutrient bar from his emergency pack. She sniffed it suspiciously before taking a cautious bite. Her expression softened as she chewed for the first time. Jack saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear. It was gratitude. When they finally reached the end of the shaft, the girl pressed her ear to the wall. She held up her hand for silence, then tapped the metal twice, a signal that it was safe. Jack pushed the panel open just a crack, peeking through. Beyond was a service balcony overlooking the cargo bay. From here, they could see the cages, the hunters patrolling, and the control console that operated the locks. Jack's mind started forming a plan. If they could reach that console without being spotted, they could open every cage at once. The girl was already watching the guards' movements, memorizing their patrol routes. When she looked at Jack again, her eyes were sharp, ready. In that moment, he realized something. She wasn't just his responsibility anymore. She was his partner, and together, they were going to take this station back. From the balcony above the cargo bay, Jack watched the hunters move like shadows among the cages. Their heavy armor reflected the dim emergency lights, and the faint hum of their weapons filled the air. The tiny alien girl crouched beside him, her sharp eyes tracking every guard's movement. She pointed at the far end of the bay, where a small control station was positioned behind a barricade of metal crates. Jack knew instantly that was the console to open the cages, but reaching it would be almost impossible without being seen. The hunters were alert, scanning the area constantly. Jack's mind searched for options. That's when the girl tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the lower deck of the bay. There, in the corner, was a group of scavenger traders. Unlike the armored hunters, these aliens wore ragged gear and carried bags filled with stolen goods. They were negotiating with one of the guards, their voices low and tense. The girl whispered a single word in her language, her tone bitter. Jack didn't understand, but her eyes said enough. These scavengers were here to buy, and what they wanted wasn't just scrap metal, it was living cargo. Jack's stomach tightened. If they made a deal, the prisoners would be taken away before he could free them, and once they were gone, he'd never find them again. He glanced at the girl, who was already shaking her head. She didn't want to wait. She wanted to act now. But Jack knew rushing in without a distraction would be suicide. He leaned closer and whispered, "We need them to look the other way." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. Her eyes narrowed, and she pointed at the scavengers again, then at the pouch on Jack's belt. Inside was the small heat-reactive crystal they'd found earlier in a crate. It was rare and valuable, something both scavengers and hunters would fight over. Jack's first instinct was to refuse. That crystal could power heat or even give them a temporary energy boost. But as he looked down at the cages, at the cold, frightened faces inside, he knew the decision was already made. They made their way down from the balcony through a side stairwell, sticking to the shadows. When they reached the lower level, Jack took the crystal from his pouch. Its faint blue glow reflected in the girl's eyes. She looked at it like it was a piece of home, but she didn't hesitate. She motioned for him to follow her lead. She walked out from the shadows first. Small and seemingly harmless, the nearest scavenger spotted her and barked a sharp command in his language. 2 others stepped forward, curious. Jack followed a few paces behind, keeping the crystal in his hand where they could see it. The scavenger leader's eyes locked onto the glow immediately. He said something to the hunters who turned their heads toward Jack. The tension in the room shifted. All eyes were on the crystal now. Jack held it up, pretending to weigh it in his palm like it was nothing special. But in reality, every alien in the bay wanted it. The leader stepped forward, speaking in a low, almost friendly tone. Jack didn't understand the words, but he could guess the meaning. A trade. He glanced at the girl, who nodded subtly, confirming his guess. Jack pretended to consider the offer, holding the crystal out slightly before pulling it back. He pointed toward the far corner of the bay, away from the control console. The scavengers looked at each other, then motioned for him to come closer. It was working. Every guard's attention shifted toward him and the crystal. Even the hunters moved away from their positions, trying to get a better look. The girl slipped away silently, moving like a shadow toward the barricade. Jack kept the scavengers distracted, stepping back slowly as they approached. One reached for the crystal, but Jack pulled his hand away again, shaking his head. The leader growled something impatiently. Jack gave a small shrug, playing the part of a stubborn traitor. Then, from the corner of his eye, Jack saw the faint flicker of blue light. The girl had reached the console. Her small fingers danced over the controls. A faint hiss echoed through the bay as one of the cages unlocked. Another hiss followed, then another. The prisoners inside began to stir, their eyes wide with hope and disbelief. The leader noticed the movement first. His head snapped toward the cages and he shouted in alarm. The hunters turned instantly, but it was too late. Half the cages were already open, and frightened figures were spilling out. Chaos erupted. The scavengers drew their weapons, the hunters roared commands, and the prisoners scattered in every direction. Jack tossed the crystal high into the air. Every scavenger and hunter's eyes followed it for that split second. And in that moment, he lunged forward, grabbing the girl from behind the barricade. She clutched a small data chip in her hand. She'd downloaded something from the console. Jack didn't have time to ask what it was. He just ran, pulling her toward the side hatch they'd entered through. Blaster shots rang out behind them. Metal clanged under their boots as they sprinted through the narrow halls. The girl's grip on his hand was tight, her breathing fast but steady. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the maintenance shaft. Only then did Jack let himself breathe. The girl opened her palm, showing him the chip. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and triumph. Whatever was on it, it was important enough that she risked everything to get it. Jack stared at it for a moment, then at her. "You've got more guts than most people I know," he said quietly. She didn't understand the words, but the way she smiled told him she understood the feeling. The crawl back through the maintenance shaft felt longer than ever. Jack's arms ached from pulling himself forward, and every sound behind them made his heart pound. The girl was just ahead, moving quickly despite the narrow space. Her small frame slipped through the tight sections easily, but she kept looking back to make sure Jack was close. The faint clink of the data chip in her hand reminded Jack that whatever she had taken from the console was important. Important enough that hunters would chase them to the ends of the station. When they finally pushed the panel shut behind them, Jack leaned against the wall, breathing hard. The girl crouched beside him, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her eyes scanned his face as if checking to see if he was hurt. "I'm fine," he muttered, though she wouldn't understand. Still, she seemed to read the tone in his voice and nodded. The room they were in was a small maintenance hub. It was dark except for the pale glow of Jack's heat lamp. Frost crept along the edges of the walls, and the air was sharp with cold. Jack pulled his toolkit open, removing the heat-reactive crystal they had taken earlier from his pouch. He walked over to the emergency power socket and slid it in. The crystal hummed softly, sending a faint pulse of warmth through the room. The girl's eyes widened at the change. She moved closer to the small vent where warm air was now seeping through. For the first time since Jack had met her, the trembling in her shoulders eased. She sat down on the floor, pulling the thermal jacket tighter around her. Her tail curled around her legs as she leaned slightly toward him. Jack sat across from her, his back against the wall. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was calm. They both knew the danger wasn't over, far from it, but for this brief moment, they could breathe. She held up the chip and tapped it against her palm. Looking at him expectantly, Jack frowned. He took his datapad from his belt and slotted the chip in. The screen flickered to life, displaying files in an alien script. He couldn't read it, but there were diagrams, station schematics, and lists, and in one of the diagrams, Jack recognized the cargo bay and several other sections marked in red. The girl pointed to the largest red section and then mimed a cage with her hands. Jack's chest tightened. There were more prisoners. The bay they had seen earlier wasn't the only one. Before Jack could say anything, a faint tremor shook the floor. The girl's ears twitched, and her eyes snapped to the door. She whispered something quickly in her own language, her voice tense. Jack didn't understand, but he didn't need to. They had been found. He killed the heat lamp and grabbed his tools. The crystal's hum faded, and the room plunged back into icy darkness. The girl moved closer to him instinctively, pressing her shoulder against his. Jack's breath slowed, listening. There it was, faint footsteps, but heavier than the girl's. The hunters were searching the maintenance corridors. Jack pointed to the ventilation grate. The girl nodded and crawled toward it without hesitation. He followed, slipping inside and replacing the grate. Just as the door to the hub hissed open, through the narrow slats, Jack could see the shape of a hunter stepping inside, its glowing visor swept the room, pausing where the heat lamp had been. It let out a low growl and moved toward the power socket. Jack and the girl stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. After a long, tense moment, the hunter turned and left. They waited until the sound of its footsteps faded before crawling deeper into the ventilation shaft. The metal was freezing under their hands. Jack's muscles were stiff from the cold, and his fingers felt numb. The girl noticed and stopped, looking back at him. Without a word, she shifted closer, pressing her small body against his side. Her warmth was faint, but in the frozen metal tunnel, it was everything. Jack almost laughed at the irony. He had given her warmth when they first met, and now she was giving it back. She tilted her head slightly, her large eyes meeting his. There was no fear there now, only trust. In that silent moment, Jack realized that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing to survive with him. They moved again, eventually emerging into another small maintenance room far from the hub. This one was completely dark, but at least it was safe for now. Jack set the heat crystal back into a socket, letting the warmth return. The girl curled up beside it immediately, glancing at him as if inviting him to sit too. He did, stretching his legs out and letting the heat seep back into his bones. Her voice broke the silence, soft and halting. Warm. Now, she said in accented human words. Jack's lips curved into a small smile. Yeah. Warm now, he replied. For a moment, the danger outside didn't matter. The hunters, the cages, the frozen halls, all of it felt far away here. In this tiny pocket of heat in the dead station, they had something rare, something that might not last, but for now, it was enough. Jack leaned his head back against the wall. Tomorrow, they would figure out how to reach the other prisoners. Tomorrow they would fight again. But tonight, in this last warmth, they rested, together. The warmth didn't last long. The faint hum of the heat crystal was comforting, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time before the hunters found this room too. He had seen the determination in their movements. They wouldn't stop until they had the girl back. And now, with the data chip, they had an even bigger reason to chase them. The girl was sitting beside the crystal, her eyes half closed, but When Jack began packing his tools, she opened them immediately. Alert again, she tilted her head, watching him strap on his gear. "Go?" she asked in her broken human words. Jack gave a small nod. "Yes, go," he replied. They crawled back into the ventilation shafts, moving fast. This time, the girl took the lead without hesitation. Jack could tell she had memorized every path. In these maintenance passages, she moved like someone who had survived by knowing the places hunters never checked. Every turn, every drop, every crawl space, she chose them with precision. Finally, they reached a large metal grate that looked out over a docking bay. Jack's pulse quickened. Beyond the grate, he saw a small emergency shuttle, old, but intact. If they could reach it, they could get off this frozen death trap. But there was a problem. The docking bay wasn't empty. 2 hunters stood guard near the shuttle, their weapons glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack cursed under his breath. There was no way to sneak past them in the open. The girl tapped his arm and pointed upward. Jack followed her gaze to see a series of overhead pipes running across the bay. They connected to a maintenance platform near the shuttle's rear. If they could climb along those pipes, they might drop down right beside the shuttle's hatch. It was risky. One wrong step and they'd be in full view. Jack nodded, and they carefully unscrewed the grate. They climbed up into the rafters, moving slowly. The pipes groaned under their weight, and Jack held his breath each time they shifted. Below, the hunters were pacing, unaware of the danger above them. Halfway across, one of the pipes gave a loud metallic creak. Jack froze. The hunters stopped too, their heads turning sharply. The girl pressed herself against the pipe, holding completely still. Seconds dragged by. Finally, the hunters resumed their patrol. Jack exhaled slowly and continued forward. When they reached the platform above the shuttle, Jack gestured for the girl to go first. She dropped down quietly. Landing beside the hatch, Jack followed, wincing as his boots hit the metal floor with a soft thud. He quickly keyed in the override code for the hatch. The shuttle door hissed open, and they slipped inside. The interior was cold and dusty, but everything looked functional. Jack moved to the cockpit. Powering up the systems, the girl slid into the co-pilot seat. Watching him with wide eyes, he began the startup sequence. But the system displayed a warning. Docking clamps engaged. Jack's stomach sank. They couldn't take off unless they released the clamps, and the controls for that were outside, in the open bay. Before he could say anything, the girl stood. She pointed to herself, then toward the bay door. Jack shook his head instantly. "No way, I'm not letting you." She cut him off with a determined look. Her small hand rested briefly on his arm. It wasn't fear in her eyes, it was trust. Then she slipped out of the shuttle before he could stop her. Jack grabbed his sidearm and followed. He saw her darting toward the docking control panel, moving fast and low, but the hunters had noticed. They shouted in their guttural language and charged. Jack fired a warning shot to draw their attention. The first hunter swung his weapon toward him, and Jack rolled behind a crate. The second kept going for the girl. She reached the panel, hands flying over the controls. With a heavy clunk, the docking clamps released. Jack popped up from cover, firing again. One of the shots hit the floor in front of the hunter, making him stumble. The girl ran back toward the shuttle, and Jack met her halfway. He scooped her up, sprinting the last few meters. They dove inside the shuttle as blaster fire scorched the doorframe. Jack slammed the hatch shut and ran to the cockpit. The girl scrambled into her seat, gripping the armrests. Jack hit the thrusters. The shuttle lifted off the deck, shaking as it broke free. A blaster bolt hit the hull, making the interior lights flicker. But they were already rising toward the bay's exit. The outer doors opened, revealing the cold stars beyond. Jack pushed the engines harder. The station shrank behind them. A dying, frozen husk inside. The girl finally let out a small breath. Her shoulders relaxing, Jack glanced at her. "You're safe now," he said quietly. She tilted her head, then leaned closer. "Warm now," she whispered, just like she had before. Jack smiled. "Yeah. Warm now." They didn't know where they were going yet. The galaxy was big, and danger would follow. But Jack had made a silent promise to himself. No matter what came next, he would keep her safe, always.